Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, Pride Month is over. But does that mean we'll get a reprieve from the degeneracy that the pride and transgender movement has come to represent? No, of course not. Not likely, as we're constantly beat over the head with it. And in fact, it's infesting and destroying things that families and communities should all be able to enjoy. I'll give you an example of something going on right here in Kentucky, something I went over to the weekend, that this ideology is just infested and made it absolutely hostile to any families going to it. And of course, why it's destroying our country as well, this infection, but not exactly the way most people think. A lot of people think of this as infecting and destroying our country from a moral side of things. Well, there's something else that it's doing that I will go over. Even more talks are now swirling around nationally regarding Beshear running for president, including one elected Republican here in Kentucky that seems to be pretty excited about a Beshear presidency, which leads to a question about what exactly is the difference now between Republicans and Democrats that are in the so-called Uni-party. It's not much, and despite that, that doesn't stop those who are members of that Uni-party from claiming to be the real Republicans and yelling about how we need to get rid of the fringe. We'll take a look at one Kentucky politician that has recently been yelling on Twitter about exactly that. Then finally, we'll look at just how big of a raise did the legislature give to the schools in order for them to pass on to the teachers. How big of a raise could they pass it on to the teachers? Raises they opted not to give, so they could go ahead and continue to complain about teachers not getting paid more rather than paying them. We'll talk about the numbers and go over that all today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Feel free to reach out to the show, info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. You can head on over to theandrewshow.com and hit the contact tab as well if you want to reach out to the show. And, without further ado, let's dig down into it now. Pride Month is over. And, normally we can rejoice because it means that we won't continue seeing some of the awful depravity that has infested our public spaces during Pride Month. Because truthfully, this Pride Month, this transgender thing, this movement about rights, what it has become in the minds of people now is this complete and utter fetish type sexual celebration of weird things. It's become about nudity and exposing yourself, about sex, and pretending that these types of things are family friendly anymore is just no longer tenable. There's too many examples of these people clearly acting like sexual degenerates in public, which doesn't really, that's not that surprising when you think about most of that culture. When you look at things like the genderqueer side of things, when you look at things like the pride side of things, when you look at even homosexual behaviors to agree, a lot of that is all surrounding and has a culture of sexual degeneracy. That's why you see that, a lot of times you'll see even homosexual men will sleep around a lot because there isn't much of this idea of monogamy, the idea of looking at that as a thing between people who love each other, the idea of looking at that is procreative behavior, all that's gone out the window. The minute that the entire concept that sex does lead to procreation has left, all you're left with then is worrying about what feels the best to you, what are you into, do whatever. And then more importantly, when you have now Pride Month and flags celebrating this, well, it's not about rights now, because what rights are there? There's really not much left. If anything, the fact that Pride Month has become what it's become, and I'm going to give you some examples of this here, and obviously you might want to have a little bit of a parental warning here. If you've got kids listening, you might want to be careful about this. But anyways, but as the rights have actually caught up, right, as gay marriage and other things, rights, putting that in quotations, but as they've really kind of achieved anything they could really ask for without now violating other people's religious rights and constitutional rights, things they really can't get to, well, the race to the bottom has now started. And we see this out of the Toronto Pride Festival. Just this perfect display, not only during the family-friendly Pride events were they having naked men, just full-on naked men, walking down the street. They even had naked men stopping and doing a hip-thrusting dance, flopping their stuff all around for kids to see. And if that wasn't just absolutely awful, and those people should be arrested for obviously exposing themselves to minors, well, then the Toronto Festival decided to go ahead and add a fetish zone, an 18 up and only area to their Pride Festival this year that included grown men laying in kiddie pools while people could come by and pee on them. People getting spanked and other things, other types of, just fetish type sexual behaviors in front of people, adding the voyeurism side of things. All of that going on the public dime in Toronto and the public square. And I understand that's Canada, but that can leak over into America, and we've been seeing it more. But it's the perfect example of that's what this pride stuff is about. And companies now buying into this whole pride thing are seeing backlash. We've seen Tractor Supply back off these things. We've seen other places back off these things because they're realizing that this is a political stance. Now, if you as a company want to take a political stance, if you decide as a company, your brand, your goal, you want to be something that brings in the liberals or brings in the conservatives, and so you're going to take a political stand with your business, then do that. Feel free to do that. That may even be a part of your business plan. I mean, we've seen things on the left, clearly companies like Starbucks and others, that their entire business plan is about, making their coffee shop about more than just coffee, to make people feel good, of course, about spending $7 on a cup of coffee, right? And so if they're doing good things with them, well, then you feel good about paying too much for that cup of coffee, of course. But then we also see it on the right. We've seen the ultra-right beer company come about after Bud Light. We've obviously seen Daily Wire launching products left and right that are obviously conservative-based, cigars, razors, streaming platforms, you name it. They're producing it, and obviously to allure more to the conservative side of things, to provide them options. But they've been doing that in large response to these leftists who've decided to just allow their company to become complete and liberal cesspools. But even if you're not a company who has decided to build their business around being political, and a lot of companies aren't, but what they have done is they allow their employees now to take political stances while at work. And they have got to recognize the folly here. If you're not a political company, right? So if you aren't like, hey, we are a conservative company, we're the ultra-right beer company, or we're, a two-way Second Amendment company, you're attracting in then people from all kinds of political spectrums to both work and to hopefully patronize your company. And you don't want to make people feel like they don't belong at your company spending money. And by belong, I mean if you represent a political stance, left or right, that can make people be like, you know what? I guess I don't feel comfortable shopping here because I know a lot of people here disagree with me. And it's gotten especially worse with these pride things because remember that now the political disagreement around how to handle, should transgender women, so men who think they're women, should they be allowed to compete against biological women in women's sports? Like, that is a question. That's a little bit of a political fight. You can have differences of opinions on them. You can be within the sport and have opinions on them, right? You can be outside the sport. You can have these opinions. But if you go outside of those areas, so you're just, let's say, just shopping somewhere that has nothing to do with sports at all, nothing to do with it, this whole men and women sports thing really shouldn't matter to this side of business. But then you see an employee sitting over here with a transgender pin on their lapel. Well, you know that person obviously disagrees with you on that standpoint. And it's one thing to just know they disagree with you on something that you could either say is political or common sense or whatever, but something completely different to know that what goes along with that is if you're with that person and you accidentally say the wrong pronouns, or just you don't go along with this whole pronoun thing completely, which is more in line with how I am. I'm not respecting, quote unquote, a person's pronouns. Well, now it's turned into a political conversation. And I don't want it to be. I'm just there to spend my money on XYZ. I'm just there to buy a sofa. Or I'm just there to learn about historic guns. This is a real thing that happened. I was there to learn about historic guns I went to Deadwood, South Dakota. And one of the actors, Deadwood, South Dakota, is wearing a trans flag. You know, I'm there to watch a reenactment of an 1880s duel. I'm not there to hear about what you believe I should call people who have a mental illness and their pronouns. And yet it scares people away, but it's affecting these companies' bottom lines, and it's only going to get worse and worse, and they need to realize it. And what they're doing in the process, this infestation of these beliefs, it's affecting a lot of things that now you can't take your kids to. I mean, I've talked about this before, taking your kids to the 4th of July parade in Lexington. You're taking a risk. They'll have a pride float, and several times those pride floats have had people wearing very, very, very inappropriate clothing with very inappropriate signs and very inappropriate words on those signs that you don't want your 6 or 7-year-old asking you about because they're too young. They don't need to be sexualized like that. Or you have situations where, you have businesses deciding to weigh into this that really maybe should be a bit more careful. And an example of this, actually, I recently went to the Kentucky Renaissance Fair. Now, honestly, I haven't been to a Renaissance Fair in about 20 years. But when I was younger, actually a teenager, I actually worked at a Renaissance Fair. And what I can tell you is that one, the general quality of things like the jousting and other things that are going on now at the Renaissance fairs have fallen off. And a big part of the reason why is because there's not as many people there. I was at the Kentucky Renaissance Fair on a wonderful weathered weekend day. It was actually tournament weekend this past weekend. So you'd think there'd be a lot of people there, but there wasn't. The parking lot was less than half full. When we came in, we came in initially, but we left around 2 o'clock or so. It was a half full parking lot. In fact, they never had parked people into this entire half. And you start to wonder why, and it's because, you look around when you're there and you're not actually seeing a lot of families anymore. And it's a big part of the reason why I believe is the fact that this whole LGBTQ, pride, trans rights, whatever, hasn't completely infected the place. You walk around there and most of the employees are wearing rainbow flags or rainbow paraphernalia. I mean, just look at this from the other side of things, okay? Imagine, and if you're on the left, okay? If you're on the right, you probably understand exactly what I mean. If you showed up to a place where everybody's wearing rainbow flags and trans flags and things, you don't feel like you belong there. You don't. And then on if you're liberal, though, and you're listening to this, and you're like, what do you mean? Why wouldn't you feel like you belong? Imagine you showed up to a business, to an event, and everybody there's wearing a MAGA hat. Everybody there's wearing a Make America Great Again hat. Or everybody there is wearing a Don't Tread on Me flag. How about that? What would you think? Would you feel like you belong there? And so when you go into who's spending money at these events, and this is why it's such a folly for this business to have all these people with these pride things, you think about who's spending money, who's enjoying these things. You're going to find one, it's going to be people with families. And you're in Kentucky. You're in Eminence, Kentucky, mind you, but you're in Kentucky. Do you think your average Kentucky family that you hope shows up and spends tons of money there? Because keep in mind, think about it this way too, and the reason why you clearly want families there is because you market and you get an adult, 2 adults to your event, but they don't have kids, okay? Your marketing cost is the same as getting a man and woman who have 3 kids to show up, but you're getting over double to triple the revenues just from tickets alone. Not to mention everything else they're going to purchase while they're there, because now they're 5 people instead of 2. But yet your marketing cost was the same. You had to convince the same amount of people to show up. But when they show up and everybody's wearing Pride everything, and because you've had so much fall off in people going, you can't afford proper jousting and tournaments anymore. Well, it pushes people away. I mean, it's so crazy. They've taken things that should be so enjoyable. For an example, they started doing these, and for those of you who haven't seen this before, this Full Metal Combat is what it's called. And literally people wear like full suits of armor like they would back in the day. They have, real metal swords that just blunt. They're not sharpened, but still the blunt swords and everything else. And they literally go at it, just attacking each other until somebody falls on the ground, or until, they get as many strikes as possible. And I mean, it's literally just 2 knights sword fighting, like having an actual sword fight. It should be like really cool. And instead, I'm not kidding you, like literally every night in this fight, Full Metal fight at the Kentucky Renaissance Fair, had a pride flag hanging off their belt. I mean, which is weird because they're playing in a sport that has men and women, right? And you'd love to hear them defend how a dude that weighs 250 pounds, because some of these guys wearing these pride flags, they weigh 250 pounds, they got 100 pounds of armor on. So they got 350 pounds to 400, going up against some woman, and there was women who went up against each other and fought there and everything else, who probably all combined with armor and their natural weight, because obviously their armor's lighter now too, weighs like 180 pounds, versus some 350, 400 pound knight. And the game is who can knock the other person over. How do they balance that? And they can't get over the fact this has now become, the minute you start throwing political statements like the rainbow flags and everything else on, it's become now a political rally. It's become a political event. And if you disagree with them, and if you're in Kentucky, over half of the people that you'd hope to bring there does, is that, and I get it, right? I get that there's going to be a lot of this transgender pride stuff at something like, from the customers, at something like a Renaissance Fair, because you can go there and you can dress up and pretend to be something you're not, which is what most of this transgender thing is about. People have horrible self-esteem, that hate themselves, that want to be anything but themselves. So they change up their genders and their sexualities and their appearances, and they try to look as weird and strange as possible. Anything they can do so they're not themselves. So it makes sense that at a place where you can dress up as somebody who's not yourself and it's more socially acceptable, it would attract in these people. But that doesn't mean your customers now have to turn it into a political rally and political statements all over the place. Instead, that's what they did. And that's why the fair, probably over the next few years, you'll see that the Kentucky Renaissance Fair will shorten up the amount of weekends that they're doing it. Because I talked to some of the not customers, to the employees there that had worked there for a while. I asked them, because I noticed this. And I said, man, it's real curious. There's not a lot of people here and everything else. And I asked them. And they admitted over the last several years, they've seen their attendance go down. But at least in their opinion, they're like, yeah, I'm not nearly seeing as many people here as we did 3-4 years ago. Now, they want to blame COVID, but it's really because this political ideology has infested it, and this goes into how can we get along as a country? How's this destroying our country? It's because if you can't literally interact with one another anymore without politics getting involved, well, you can't get along. Back in the day, it used to be, we politically disagreed, but we could do simple things like a sport or Renaissance Fair, or we could go for a walk or join a club or do anything else without being beat over the head with somebody else's politics. But we don't have that anymore, which means we don't have community anymore outside of community of people who have the same political beliefs as us. And it makes people hate one another. I don't think there's a whole lot of hate on the right, actually, though, because I think a lot of people who are conservatives are used to more so hiding their political beliefs. It's part of the reason why I think we've seen liberals kind of infesting more and being able to get their ways in companies, because the conservatives are used to just not talking about it. But still, everything now has become about politics, and it's something people generally don't agree with. each other on. I mean, around 50-50 on average. Now, that isn't to mean, just because I'm saying, look, can we leave politics out of our everyday life, means that politicians now need to all get along. If you're an elected politician, we should expect you to fight the other side tooth and nail. And I don't need you to get along with those people. In fact, I'd rather you act exactly how you act to them in private, in public. But if we want to get along in society, when we're outside of doing political activities and political things, we should really check it at the door. But it's, like I said, I'm seeing it more from the left. The right's kind of reacting to it. But it started with the left, and especially this pride stuff, where they just can't. And if you talk to them about it, you're like, can't you see how that's espousing a political belief and how that would make people who politically disagree with you feel unwelcomed? They'll play dumb. They'll be like, what are you talking about? Pride isn't political. My pride flag's about saying anybody's welcome. It isn't telling conservatives they're not welcome. Pride's family friendly. You know, they'll just gaslight you. We all know what it's really about. Speaking of politicians, last week with the whole Biden debate, we've seen Beshear's name circulating even more on a national level, being talked about as a potential replacement. Once again, let me lay this out. And I think it's even clearer now based on Biden's behavior. I don't think Biden's going anywhere per se, because it's very difficult to convince somebody to give up power. It's even harder to convince the people around that person in politics to get that person to give up the power, because that means they lose their jobs. And I've said it before, the only way they're going to pull off a switcheroo here and it will work is if Jill Biden steps in. If they try to pull off a switcheroo and it's not Jill Biden, Jill, not Joe, but Jill Biden who takes over for Joe, who, I mean, at this point, I think Jill probably is the one really running the country anyways. I don't think it'll come to fruition that Joe steps aside. And we've seen, of course, too, the media backtracking its way off of, you know, the claims it's made before about, oh, Biden needs to step down and everything else. I mean, saw Joe Scarborough, you know, he came out right after the debate, was like, this is awful. Biden should step to the side of everything else. And then on Twitter, he's like, oh, my colleague made this point. She's so right. Biden should stay. But putting that to the side, talking about Beshear, though, as a potential replacement. Let's say something does happen, and my initial indication that there can't be a flip, I'm wrong, that Biden, for some reason, does give it up. He's convinced to. I don't know how they convince him, but they convince him to. Blackmail or something, who knows. Beshear ain't going to replace him. Beshear doesn't have national name ID. I said this last week. I don't understand all these people. Nobody knows who Beshear is outside of people in Kentucky and some of those ultra elites in the Democrat circles. You go talk to your rank and file Democrat voter and you say, hey, get excited here to vote for in 2 months this white guy from Kentucky, this supposedly straight white married guy from Kentucky. Get excited to go vote for him. To the Democrat base, they're not excited. If you want somebody to create instant excitement, because this is what their politics has become on the left, you'd have to put out a minority or a woman or a gay guy. You got to put out something like that. You can't put out a straight white guy from Kentucky, Beshear, and get them to get excited in 3 months to go out and vote for the dude who's got no national name ID at all. But despite that, a lot of people keep bringing it up. And a lot of leftists keep mentioning it on the Twitterverse, not realizing there's more to life than, of course, what Twitter says. Now, with that in mind, though, this hasn't stopped one Republican in Kentucky from weighing in on the issue. Of course, Michael Adams, it's like Michael Adams is clearly trying to make a run for governor here once Beshear's term's up. He's going to, I believe, make a run for governor. We'll cover something today that makes it clear that Michael Adams, Secretary of State's going to make a run for governor. But it seems like in the process he's forgotten that you do have to get past a Republican primary. And there's really not a lane for him in the Republican primary that I could see. His only hope is that he can differentiate himself so much that he's going to be able to win. Like, when people ask, me about these numbers, and I'm just estimating here. You have 20% right now of the Republican primary voting group that are the type that would vote for Michael Adams. They're the type that vote for Mitch McConnell. They're the same type that crossed the aisle to vote for Beshear instead of Cameron a few years ago. They're the same type. They're the kind that call themselves Republican, and they really just, they're fine with gun control. They're fine with a lot of things. You'll find these Republicans a lot of times in urban areas. And I feel like they just call themselves Republican because they want to be interesting to their friend. They fulfill this role of being like their friend's Republican, so they can claim to be talk to people from the other side, and so they can claim they have Republican friends, right? And they want to be interesting in the conversations, okay? And I think that's what it is. But there's about 20% of the Republican voting electorate that would vote for Michael Adams, that's their kind of guy. Then there's 20% of the electorate, which falls into like the Trump loyalists, absolutely love Trump. Trump can do no bad. And then you've got about 60% of the electorate that, is on the spectrum of conservativeness, either very conservative or not very conservative. And a lot of them will, of course, Trump does so well because a lot of them do like Trump still as well. I'm not going to say he could never do anything wrong to make them not, well, at this point, he probably couldn't in the presidential side of things. But in a primary, you could see them going away from him if a right person with the right message comes along to convince them, is what I mean. So you got 20% that are like diehard populist Trump people, really huge Trump people. And then you got 20% that are diehard, I hate literally the Republican Party. They probably have self-esteem issues as well. They hate themselves. And they're the type that vote for the McConnells. They vote for Michael Adams, and you have the other 60%. Michael Adams must be thinking, I need to wrap up that 20%, and I'm going to win a Republican primary with that 20% support. Now, I think he's wrong, because I think he's counting on the same kind of thing that you get with Secretary of State, where he can just financially dominate because he himself is wealthy from some political work he does. And so he's able to self-fundraise, self-fund his own campaigns more than other people running for Secretary of State have been. And because Secretary of State isn't something a lot of people pay attention to, people just vote for a name that they recognize in the primaries. So when it came to the primaries, almost 8 years ago when Adams first ran, he got his name out there a lot. Of course, he didn't have a whole lot of, public statements. People weren't really following him a whole lot. He was able to dump, $200,000 or $250,000 during the primary, more than the other people were able to. And so he was able to generate a pretty solid win there in the primary. And then from there, you got the party behind you, and then they follow through. Then the second primary round, it's just the same thing of name ID. Nobody running against him had enough money to that they were even a name that the majority of conservative primary voters even knew existed. And even if they knew they existed, they didn't know enough about them to vote for them. Nobody else hit that dollar amount. And so Adams wins that. But when you're running in a governor primary, everybody's got money. Not everybody, but there's going to be 4 or 5 candidates that have the money and everybody knows their names. You can't self-fund your way into the governor's office unless, you're Matt Bevin. And so with that in mind, Michael Adams, I don't know what lane he thinks he's carving out, but it's like he's put it to the side. So what he said was, he made one tweet that said, perhaps, a Beshear presidency isn't sounding so crazy after all. Then somebody commented, Beshear will win the 2028 election for president. You'll be the governor at the end of his term. And Michael Adams responded to that comment, to that tweet, and said, we have a deal. We have a deal. So he's literally like, hey, I'm fine with Beshear being president. I just want to be governor. I'm fine with Beshear being president. I don't think Beshear's that bad. Which leads to the question, what is the difference between a Republican in the Uni-party and a Democrat in the Uni-party? The one party, right? And you'd hope there'd be Republican and Democrat, but this is just the one party. And sure, Beshear more actively pushes the LGBTQ stuff, and Adams really doesn't. That's about it. I mean, it's not like the Uni-party people like Adams and the McConnells. It's not like they feel the opposite. It's not like, when you hear the left pushing on things like abortion and the gender theory garbage and CRT and all those other things. It's not that they disagree with it, but they're not going to push the opposite. They don't really care. I mean, they don't really care about abortion or Second Amendment and all those things. Those are things they pretend to care about come election season, I'm sure, and they'll run their campaign ads, but that's not really what matters to them. What matters to them most of all is doing the important work of the government, which simply means redistributing wealth to those that give enough to their campaigns. For the Democrats, it's the main focus. They'll have that same main focus, but they'll just push more on the LGBTQ stuff because they see it as an avenue to bring in voters and hold voters. Because, if you can win people, they have recognized that this pride stuff, as I was talking about at the beginning, that is, if you believe in those things, you are a Democrat and you are a liberal. They recognize that better than even some conservatives do. And so they believe if they can get enough people indoctrinated into this gender theory pride stuff BS, well, then they will have more and more voters. That's why they push it. It's got nothing to do with their actual feelings on the subject. It's just about holding power. It's all about holding power. And so those Republicans in the Uni-party, they don't even see the base stuff, though, as avenues anymore to attract in voters because they look at the polls and they say, well, Democrats look at the polls and say, oh, we need to convert more people over to our viewpoint on this crazy fringe issue so that way we can hold on to more voters in the future. Like, let's just take an issue, take a belief system on it and try to win as many people over to our side and just push on that. While the Democrat or the Republicans in the Uni-party are like, hey, let's not get bothered. If we have a viewpoint that isn't per se popular with the public, well, we'll just change the viewpoint. We don't care. As long as we can keep giving money to the people who give money to us so we can stay in power and feel special, we want to do it. Because, though, the Uni-party has generally just abandoned any kind of the issues that the conservative base actually cares about, it's been able to move what is considered moderate or the center farther away from the conservative viewpoint, the traditional conservative viewpoint. And that leaves some people that are part of that kind of Uni-party that end up getting corrupted by that Uni-party to start saying, well, look, you know what? I think our fringes are the problem. We need to get rid of them. They think the fringes are the problem because they look at their primary systems and they see people who are winning that come in then and say, hey, look, we disagree with what you're doing here and calling yourselves Republicans. You're not Republican at all. You've been corrupted by the power, by the pen that says you're a special member of some legislature or another. You've become bad. And in the process of that, you've given up your principles. And so you're going to be replaced because you no longer represent your base. And they hate that. And so rather than addressing the fact that they are not who they promised to be when they first got elected, they'd rather just lament that there's people that still even exist that actually would support somebody like them when they first ran. Not what they've become, but when they first ran, the people that supported them, they're mad that they still exist. They didn't shift with them. It's obvious of that. We need but look at now former Kentucky State Senator Whitney Westerfield. Whitney has stepped down from being in the state Senate after, I think, 8 years or so, or 12 years or so. I don't know exactly how long he's been in. 2012. He's been in the state Senate since 2012. So, yeah, he's decided he's not running for re-election after 12 years. And so he gave up his seat. Somebody else has taken over for him. But he's certainly become somebody who he must not be planning on running for office again, or he's planning on running for the state Supreme Court, which is nonpartisan. And so he's trying to, or some judgeship, also nonpartisan. So he's trying to, attract in as many middle of the road voters as he could, because he wants to be something that can be, I can pick up Republicans because they'll say, oh, he used to be a Republican state senator. But then I can turn around and pick up liberals because they're like, but he's a really liberal state senator for Republicans, so we can vote for him too. And so because of that, so we see a pretty interesting comment from Whitney Westerfield when we look at a recent post he made on X, on Twitter, where he reposted a New York Post headline that said, "Squad member Cori Bush losing by 22 points in new Dem primary poll." And Whitney Westerfield commented on that and said, "Now we need the Republicans to do the same by getting their fringe, non-conservative, populist people out of office." So Whitney, let me get this straight here, Whitney, okay? You now think that they're fringe members. We need to get rid of them. That our fringe members of conservatives is the same as the fringe members on the left. But you're ignoring the fact of what the political shift has been. Because what's been considered moderate has shifted to the left, not to the right. And the people like Westerfield, people who are running towards that moderate, well, he now looks at people who think the same way he did maybe, 8 years ago or so, as crazy. I mean, for an example, in 2016, he supported a bill, sponsored a bill, that would give a criminal penalty to anyone who did an abortion before giving an ultrasound. So, it was law when you did an abortion, you had to give an ultrasound of the child first before the person could get the abortion, woman could get the abortion. And Whitney wanted to add, or was the sponsor on a bill that would add a criminal penalty to not delivering the ultrasound. Now, you want to talk about criminalizing abortions now? Criminalizing any behavior around abortion, like literally making a criminal penalty to do an abortion that violates Kentucky law, that a criminal penalty that falls in line with what you just did by murdering a child? He's like, when he's like, let's not be hasty now. That seems extreme. But even he admits he's changed. It's not just conjecture by me saying that people like Whitney Westerfield, they come in conservative, they change, and then they turn around and get mad at everybody else who now wasn't corrupted like them, that dares to think the same way they did before they decided to become just another member of the swamp. As evidence of this, he put in place a statement on a press release he made on March 30th. Here's reading now from it. "Proof that we never stop learning. The longer I've spent in office, the more willing I've been to keep an open mind to policies a younger Whitney might have ignored or simply dismissed out of hand." Ignored or dismissed out of hand. So he's admitted that, I've changed. When I first came into office, I would have never passed these things or approved these things, and now I'm different. Which is, fine. You've shifted politically. You have to answer to your voters for that, and yourself and your God for that. But don't turn around now and get mad at everybody else who still believes the same thing you believed, and say they're fringe, they need to go. These people need to look at themselves in a mirror occasionally. But, anybody who doesn't see how it really is, well, there are the extreme ones. That's the belief of this Uni-party. Speaking of just crazy things to mention here, something I went over last week, I think I mentioned in passing, was about how much the legislature gave to the schools where they could afford to give a raise to the teachers if they wanted to. And I wanted to actually break those numbers down, okay? How much money did the legislature give more to these schools over the next 2 years? So looking at our budget here, when we look at the SEEK formula, the SEEK formula is the per pupil funding that our legislature offers to schools per a student that shows up, attendance and everything else, and that's the amount per year that they're paid out. Well, the legislature increased the amount of payout per student for the next 2 years on average, $306 per student per year. So basically, the legislature said, we're going to give you another $306 per student per year to the public schools from the state. Then on top of that, they also passed a transportation funding budget that did an additional $339 million per year in transportation funding, an additional $339 million per year. That's around 700,000 students we have in Kentucky. So that works out to about $484 per student. So if you add 484 together plus the SEEK formula increase at 306, that works out to about $790 per student more per year. Now, they've got a 15-to-1 teacher ratio on average in Kentucky. So that's an $11,850 per teacher in more funding that the state has given. The average teacher salary in Kentucky is $56,000. And just the money they give them more above what they gave them already. So literally, the schools just didn't spend anything else, just nothing else. The legislature gave them enough money for a 21% raise for every teacher in their district. 21% raise on average. But yet, most school districts gave teachers maybe 2 or 3% raise. They demanded it be a line item on top of all this other spending, because there'll never be enough. But more importantly, they know that the legislature constitutionally really can't give an 11% across the board raise to teachers, but that's not really they're asking for. Keep in mind, they're asking for 11% raise per school employee. Keep that in mind. But they couldn't line item that because, well, districts set what they pay people, what they pay teachers, what they pay school personnel, and the per pupil funding wouldn't be even across the board, which is unconstitutional in Kentucky, and they know that. And so they were setting up a thing, an opportunity, where they knew they would never get their raise. They can continue to yell about it. The legislature comes in and gives them enough money for a 21% raise, and they're like, well, we're not going to use it for that. Because if we foul up and use it, if we let you actually solve our problem of paying teachers more, well, we can't keep yelling at you to give us more money. And that's what they really want. They just want more and more money. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. We'll be back here tomorrow. I know today, change up in format from tomorrow. What you'll find is there'll be about an episode or two a week that are formatted for the radio, while the rest of them are formatted simply for the podcast listening experience, which I think some of you probably more enjoy the more podcast setup episodes than you do necessarily the radio episodes. I'm freer to say different things on those shows than I am on the radio episodes. But regardless, the reason for the change, we had a station in Louisville, 970 The Answer, 970 AM, WGTK in Louisville, pick up the Andrew Cooperrider Show. And so we've got a few episodes a week that are formatted for them, and then a few episodes a week that are formatted for the podcast version. Show is no longer on WZXI, but it is airing now on 970 AM WGTK. That's a pretty big move, pretty big station here in the state for those of you who are unaware. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the show. info@theandrewshow.com. Anyways, until tomorrow, we'll be seeing you.